Jen. It is awesome to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing, Mike?
I am doing great. Why do you have Paris in your background?
Because I dream of visiting Paris one day, and that helps keep the dream alive back there.
It is awesome. What is it about Paris that makes you want to visit one day?
I think it's like has so much culture and art and history, and just everything is so just interesting. Just like sitting and watch in a cafe and watching people go by, and a lot different than maybe California with less history, literally.
Have you watched the movie Midnight in Paris?
I have. When I go like back in time,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's fun.
It's awesome, and it's an awesome soundtrack. Like the music is great, and that's what I think of. That's the movie I think of whenever I see the Eiffel Tower in the background. And I know this year the Olympics were out there, so that's a big thing. But
Yeah, that
I
was
have never been.
fun to see.
Yeah, I've never been to France. I spent some time in Spain and in the UK. Three places: Germany, France, and Ireland are all on my list when I finally get back out to Europe again one of these days.
I would also love to visit those places.
Awesome.
All of
So
Europe.
I mean, we could talk about travel.
Yeah, we could.
That's not the intention of the podcast, but we can do it. So I know you as like when I think of process documentation, you're one of the first people I think of. Or when I see you, I think of process documentation. Is that the right thing to think about?
It is, and I'm very glad that you think that. I feel like I'm doing all I can to be associated with process documentation. It's something that's definitely not talked about enough, and something I wish I had more resources on when I needed them back in other roles.
Why is it not talked about enough?
I think because it's not super exciting and it's not like, click a button and your problem's going to be solved like all the software companies promote like their tech tools and why everyone likes to talk about tech and tools. And it's just discipline and routine and setting up systems that aren't just tools. And it's, not super glamorous, but it's important work.
It is very important work. Why do you wish you would have had more resources in previous roles? Like, what was it that got in the way, or what happened that made you say, I wish we would have done more of this or could have done this better? What was the experience like?
So I was doing a lot of building things from scratch, which was weird because it was like 2020,
Okay.
2019, 2020. I'm like, I shouldn't have to build anything from scratch. There should be resources online that like tell me best practices for pretty much everything in business by this point in, the universe. So it was very strange to only find maybe like in customer facing documentation information online. And I really want to help prevent people from having to build things from scratch or learn from scratch or learn from trial and error because it just takes so long, as I'm sure, working with your clients as well. But what has your experience been like with process documentation and seeing companies that probably aren't doing it or maybe are doing it well?
Yeah. So I'm a big fan. Or when I was a kid, I was a big fan of the A-Team. And Hannibal was one of his quotes was, "There's always a plan, and I love it when a plan comes together." And I kind of would reshape it and say, I love a good process, and there always is a process, and I love it when a process comes together. And my experience is, even people say that they're not process oriented or that there's not a process, ultimately operate in a process. They've just allowed it to happen, that it's happening around them. And if they took a break and documented some things,
Mm-hmm.
they would actually realize, oh, there are things, a certain set of results, and there might be even some things in there that I don't need to do. Like for me, it's like finding my car keys. So I leave them on the dash in the Jeep in the garage, which now, anybody can now break in the house, grab, all of that kind of stuff. So hey, don't break in my house, but I leave them there, and I always know that they're there, and they're not, and that's a better place for them to be for me. We've got cameras set up all over this, so if you do break into my house, we'll catch you. But we've got the keys are always there, so I don't need to run around the house and look for them. The time that the keys are not there is when I fail to follow the process, which is take the key out of the ignition,
Mm-hmm.
put it up on top of the dash, and I walk out of the car with a key and I have it in my pocket and then it ends up someplace else. And so there's failures in the process that get in the way of success, but there's always a process that's happening. So that's been my experience that people don't like to talk about it because it is not sexy. It's not interesting. And it gets in the way of creativity. And my view is if you follow a process, you can be even more creative and more
Yeah.
innovative and drive more things. What do you think?
I agree. I usually say like do the processes at least to start with on things that are repeated that are like not super creative because that frees up your brain for creating new things. If you already are following the list of instructions for things you've already set, not set in stone, but things you've already at least tried once, wrote it down, you're working on improving it, but you don't have to use as much creativity to start it.
One of the other things I see out there, and I'm interested in how you help people work through this, are things like process for the sake of process or adding too many steps in process, like overcomplicating. So, are either of those ones that you see more often than others, or one that you want to go a little bit deeper into? Maybe we go deep into both of them. Where would you like to start? Like either the risk of process for the sake of process, or the risk of overcomplicating the process and just trying to do too much and make it too rigorous.
Maybe let's start with overcomplicating.
Okay.
I see I think people are more afraid of these two things, and that's why they say they don't do documentation than they actually happen. But we'll still talk about it. For overcomplicating, that can be probably more avoided if people get peer input about their processes, like in every stage, like very early, like write a first draft, ask someone, can you understand this? Is this too many steps? And then keep thinking about the process as evolving, but that doesn't mean adding. That doesn't always mean adding. As you mentioned, I think in your answer earlier, like you could find improvements, you could take things out, you could find efficiencies if you write it down. But if you don't write it down, how do you know what can be taken out, what can be added, what can be added, what can not be added, what doesn't need to be added to overcomplicate it?
What's
And
the
go
what's the
ahead.
fear? Yeah, what's the fear in writing things down? Like why do people struggle with writing it down?
I think one reason is I think you mentioned the creativity part that people are afraid it's going to like take all their autonomy and creativity and ability to make decisions on their own. Another reason is it just takes time to write things down, and they don't realize that making mistakes each time or doing things differently each time actually takes more time over time. If we could say the word time a few more times, but I think one other reason is they might be afraid that like they're not an expert. They're just the one doing the process right now. They didn't create it. So maybe like they don't feel like they own it enough to write it down and start improving it. And I'm sure there's more reasons, but what have you seen, Mike?
I, I think you hit on them. The other one that I would add in there, and Jen and I run into this. So Jen is my wife. The not this Jen, the other
No.
another Jen, but it's that, hey, my process for writing things down is, and she likes to write notes, and before you know it, we've got notes all over the place, and I've got notes all over the place. They're not super helpful because they're only here in this area. And there are
Yes.
so many opportunities to digitize this information and make it so that you don't have to write it down over and over and over again. So it's how do we leverage tools in this part of the process to help improve effectiveness and efficiency? And that's it's that, hey, I don't feel comfortable typing things up. I want to write it down here. But if it stays here on this note
Mm-hmm.
card, it it can get lost because we just move on to the next thing, and then we move on to the next thing, and then we move on to the next thing, and then everybody thinks, hey, we've talked about this before, how come we nothing changed? Well, the reason nothing changed is we didn't assign it to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
That person didn't take ownership. It wasn't clear what they were going to do next, and we didn't hold everybody accountable to moving those things forward. Because sometimes the accountability piece is not that the person didn't care about it, it's because we created a system that got in the way of them being able to do it. We've poured more stuff on that was all of a sudden another one of the priorities. So I would say the documenting on paper instead of putting it in a digital collaborative environment. And then the other one I would add on it is then we, in between that discussion and the next conversation, we put more stuff on the person's plate.
Mm-hmm.
So just crap leadership.
Yeah, I was going to mention leadership not supporting documentation was another blocker that people run into because they just want something that's easily associated with revenue, or billable hours if you're like an agency or consultancy. And it's difficult to tie documentation directly to revenue, though you can tie it to efficiency, which then can be tied to revenue and improvements also. There's many things, but it's not a
So many,
direct.
yeah, so many things. So what are some things, what are some things that we can do? How can we get better with documentation?
I would say starting small. This is always my first step. Starting small, starting with something that you do, maybe a process you do weekly. It's helpful if it's repeated often, so you can get like in the habit of reviewing it and improving it and clarifying it. And probably a small task that's not super important, so you're not putting a lot of pressure on yourself. Like what not to do is don't like try to do documentation of your entire sales process for your first piece of documentation ever, because that is too complicated and it's going to be too much pressure on yourself. And that was, I guess, the first piece of advice that I would give.
How Let's talk about that reflective process, like having some kind of feedback loops in here where we're
Mm-hmm.
evaluating and saying, we documented something and then we just didn't do anything with it. So it was documented, it was on a piece of paper and nobody saw it because it was either here or even was on a
Mm-hmm.
digital piece of paper. How do you create space for reflecting and assessing the either the viability of the process, the accuracy of the process, the changes in the process, the ways to optimize? Like where does that reflection piece come in, and how do you help people support that?
I would say hopefully people are using a project management system.
Okay, cool.
Number one. So you can assign, like, hey, can you review this piece of documentation I'm working on? That could be a task for a different person. You could assign yourself like quarterly reviews for recurring tasks for reviewing the process because it probably has changed. Ideally, you're changing it in real time, but there's probably things you may not have caught in real time. Or maybe you have some space to think quarterly about, hey, this could be improved now, but I couldn't think about that like while I was deep into the process. Another thing is having a communication channel. Like I recommend like maybe a Slack channel about processes, or maybe think of a funner name so people don't tune it out. And don't call it documentation because people are not going to pay attention to that. Give it some more interesting name, like processes is at least slightly more interesting. People might pay attention to that, but then you can say like, here's a new piece of documentation you can review. If you have input, let me know. If you have questions, if something doesn't make sense, let me know. And there's many other things, but I'm going to stop there so we can continue.
I think it's awesome. A couple of things I heard there is, yeah, make sure you improve the documentation. Come up with a way. We'll start with documenting things. Start small. Don't feel like you've got to document War and Peace or the entire operating system of your
Yeah.
entire organization and all of that other stuff. Like start small, demonstrate some success around how to document, how to gather information, show what changed inside the business, share that with others, and it'll
Mm-hmm.
start to attract more people. And it won't feel like we're documenting for the sake of documenting.
Yeah.
And realize that some people just aren't comfortable documenting. They're not comfortable typing. They're not comfortable. They're like putting things into a space where it can be where it can be
Like judged,
reviewed, or,
maybe.
and that's an
In
awesome
theory.
word. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, imagine that. How we feel judged as we're documenting, or as we're writing things down, or as we're typing things, or taking notes, and doing that in a public forum. Don't judge your people in that kind of stuff, because that's gonna, if that judgment will get in the way of success. Is that fair?
That's fair. Yes.
So we've talked about documentation. We've talked about kind of simplifying, aiming small, starting with small things. We talked about reflection. We talked about feedback, getting others involved in it, not trying to do this in isolation. How does that influence what we do and how we think about onboarding people inside an organization? Like what is what is that, what kind of impact can this part of the documentation piece and getting things on paper, what kind of impact can it have on creating a better onboarding experience for folks?
That's a great question. Thank you, Mike. It can create a more feeling of like self-service. People can find answers on their own. They don't have to wait for an answer. They can go find the documentation because in onboarding, they'll be trained about their documentation culture. They will know that there's something to help them, even if it's, say, like my company I worked for was remote and asynchronous. So we had people in all time zones. So you didn't have to wait like 24 hours for like the next person to sign on and answer your question, probably for most things, because the documentation could likely at least point you in the right direction on how to do something or what the next step should be. That was just one way, but it solves a lot of mysteries for people coming into a new place and wondering like, how does this company work? Instead of trying to like drink from the fire hose from everyone's verbal answers on every meeting, they can be like, I know this is documented. I can go back and refer later. And there's different formats, so you can reinforce learning in different ways. So maybe you have a call about a topic and then you can send them documentation afterwards, or you can send them before and then they can just come to the call with their questions. It's many things. I'll stop there because I just
What,
look like you have a question.
yeah. Well, thanks for seeing the nonverbal. So yeah, I do. Like, as we break some of that stuff around, or break some of that stuff out, like what are some basic things that, let's talk about mistakes first and then talk about ways that we can solve for them. What are some of the what are some of the mistakes that organizations typically make when thinking about or executing on onboarding? So both thinking about it and then actually doing the work. Like, what are some of the common mistakes that happen out there that you've seen?
A common mistake is not having any,
Yeah.
or only having like, here's how to use our software for what you're going to use every day. I'm like, well, that's important, but more about like, here's who your team members are, meet your team, here's how your role fits into the company, here's how your work impacts other people. There's so many other things that people need to learn to feel welcome, to feel confident, to be up to speed and being productive in their role faster instead of trying to figure it out all on their own every time. Also, for the people at the company who are doing the onboarding of other people, or like the managers who are supposed to be doing at least the onboarding, they're going to receive a lot fewer questions if they put in this time up front to create more of an onboarding process that answers the question. So they're not answering, the same question over and over every time someone is onboarded, because they will have answered that once the question gets asked once, like put it in either the onboarding documentation or somewhere that it gets answered before it's asked.
It's interesting. Actually, look, what percent, if you were just a ballpark percentage, whether it's experience or even just kind of guessing, whichever one, and if you have the direct experience, say that you've got the direct experience here, but what percentage of companies are out there, what percentage of companies out there do you think have a clearly documented onboarding process? If you were just either based on experience, data, or venturing a guess.
I don't know, 20%. Maybe that's because a lot of probably the bigger companies have a documented process on whether it's up to date or not, whether it's a good process, unsure, but it might at least be documented.
So think about that. Let's say 1 out of 5 have actually documented something. And even of that 1 out of 5, it may have not been updated in the last 3 months or 6 months or a year or 5 years, whatever it is. So if it hasn't been updated, we don't know if it's accurate. But like 1 out of 5, that's probably generous. But like 1 out of 5 doing it, and then even when you do it, they've not taken the time to update it and keep it current. And if they're not updating and keep it current, then I would imagine that when people come into the organization, they don't even know where to go to look for it. And then they're not getting feedback there. So this becomes a really cool way for you to differentiate yourself in your market as you create an experience for people as you bring them on, documenting that onboarding process, revisiting that onboarding process, testing for effectiveness of the onboarding process. And if you want to retain employees that you've spent a lot of time hiring, this is a great way to look. And that has a direct impact on revenue, a direct impact on your business and success. Is that fair?
It's definitely, that's true. I was also going to ask you, have you ever had a great onboarding experience, Mike, that stands out in your memory?
I cannot think of a great onboarding experience that I've had. I know that, like, with one of the organizations I'm working with right now, we're working on documenting the onboarding piece because we don't have it. It doesn't exist out there. So we're documenting in real time and we're sharing with the people that we brought on. I can't think of a very good onboarding. I can think of what the difference was inside large organizations or organizations that were a little bit more structured. I knew that day one was paperwork. You come into the you know where to show up, so you show up at the office. And the last time I was onboarded into an organization, that was where I went. I went to an office to go through and fill out all the paperwork, and then you get the last real time that I did it, I got a 3-ring binder with a bunch of stuff. And for those of you who don't know what a 3-ring binder is, look it up. You'll see a visual of it. But imagine this thing that has a bunch of paper in it that when you need to add new paper to it, you open up the binder and put new paper in and you take something out. And there would be sections that ideally those sections were updated on the whole, and each one of those binders would get updated here. But that's how long it's been since I've gone through that type of direct onboarding process. And it felt more mechanical. It was like I was a widget that was getting pushed through a system, not a person that was being brought into an organization.
Yeah, I've seen that as a complaint as well in some of the research I've been doing about like people thinking it's too cold, it's not human enough. It's like they only get automated emails and like video recorded lessons, and that's it. I'm like, no, you need the human touch at least once a day, some kind of human interaction with their team, with the onboarding manager, with their manager, with somebody.
Why is that human interaction important?
I think especially for since a lot of companies are remote,
Yeah.
and it's still sort of a new thing, not as much anymore like 2024 compared to like 2020, but that could be hard for people because they feel like isolated. It's different than like being in an office where you're at least surrounded, even if people aren't talking to you, you kind of like hear things going on. That's sort of like if you have a good Slack culture that you can kind of recreate that, you can see like what's going on in the company, what people are talking about. But a lot of companies don't have that. It's a lot of like private messages and one-on-one calls, and you can't really see what's happening and what you should be doing and what other people are doing, not like in a spying way, but just like what you would overhear in person in the office kind of way. And I forgot, now I'm rambling and I forgot where I was going with this.
So something I heard there, which I get really powerful. Like this is the stuff. There are people. You're out there. You're listening to this. You're hearing this, and you're either saying, God, "I'm either in the middle of going through this because I'm onboarding into a new organization, or I'm in the middle of going through this because I'm bringing someone new into the organization, or in the middle of it because I know that we're growing in other areas of the business." So we're all in there in some way, shape, or form, either because we're going through it ourselves, or we have people around us that are going through it. And there's this thing that Jen highlighted in there around the culture of the organization, specifically, and I think a culture is how we do what we do. How do we communicate inside the organization? What are those an in-person meeting that happens at a certain day of the month every month, or a team meeting that happens a certain day of the week every week, or something like that? There's a how we do what we do inside the organization. And remember, if somebody comes in, they have no idea. They're walking into a new place, like me being dropped in France and having to use the only French I know, which is mon petit chou, which is a term of endearment. It's like my little cabbage head. But it's the only thing I know. I'm dropped into an environment where I'm not familiar. You've got people coming into your organization. They're not familiar and they want to do good. And so clarity around communication and how we do what we do is really important. Would you agree, Jen?
Yeah, transparent communication, building that culture of transparent communication. It's part of a good onboarding, it's part of documentation. It's like out there for people to see how everything works, how things fit together. Having not public, but like open Slack channels so
Yep.
people can go find answers themselves or ask questions to the right people. That's all super important for culture, for a
It's
good culture.
Well, and it's one of those things like we were talking about before about the process piece, and some of them are organic and some of them are by design. Culture also gets created either by design or organically, or a combination of both. And you can and if you know how to manipulate's the wrong word, but if you know how to
Guide maybe.
yeah, that's a better, much better word. So if you know how to guide that properly based on a direction that you're moving toward, imagine what can happen as you one, bring on the right people in your business, retain those people, and when they create you create this experience that aligns with what they went through in the hiring process, like the pre-boarding process. Are if things work well and they're consistent, they're likely referring you as a good organization to work for, the type of company that they with them. It's a critical function to how businesses are operating. And to Jen's point, I don't believe that organizations are doing, actually, I know organizations are not doing it well because either they're not documenting it or they're not revisiting those processes. What's another mistake that people make when it comes to onboarding? And, just broadly speaking, when it comes to onboarding, what are some of the other things that you've seen people make mistakes on?
I think not having time built in before meeting the team, because that was
Okay.
always the thing, or at least it grew from 10 to 20. And so we had them meet with every person in the company. If you're a bigger company, you probably can't do that for a one-on-one meeting, get to know you sort of thing, to know more about the team, but you can probably do at least like their direct team, maybe a few other people that they might work with. And another key point to that is making sure those people who already work at the company, like their calendars are easily available for scheduling, or you pre-schedule that, so that person doesn't keep rescheduling. The more tenured person doesn't keep rescheduling, because obviously everyone is busy, but that's really important to get the new people feeling like belonging and knowing their team.
It is cool to hear you say it that way, because we know that people are busy. And if onboarding is not a priority in your business, it's going to get deprioritized for other things and the other noise. So making sure that people defend and hold that time sacred is really important. Very, very cool. Jim, what about, I've heard, and I've heard sometimes, a lot of times what we'll talk about in revenue roles is onboarding in the context of onboarding customers, right?
Mm-hmm.
We'll put some
Yes.
time and attention to onboarding customers. And in this instance, we're talking about onboarding customers. They just happen to be internal customers rather than external customers. One of the things that's being talked about more is everboarding, and having the onboarding piece never really end. Like there's this constant kind of like
Mm-hmm.
power up system that's happening. Is that something you're seeing?
I have been seeing people talk about it. I haven't been seeing it actually happen,
Okay.
but I like that it's being talked about and bringing like that learning and development piece ongoing, and having that being more attention on that, because just hearing things once during onboarding, again, you're not going to remember it forever. Don't expect people to remember things if they don't hear them several times and often. So especially like some of the culture pieces of onboarding would be good to revisit, maybe at least yearly. I was sort of thinking about that, like a re-onboarding, I think I was calling it that, when I was thinking about developing it in my last role. But I like everboarding better, because that can be just like the time set aside every month for some sort of education, partly about the company, but maybe partly about other things related to their role.
That was going to be my next question. It's like, what's the right frequency? Like, how would you, when you, if you were to think about creating that experience from an everboarding or reboarding, re-onboarding perspective, what, what's the frequency that what's a frequency that might make sense to do something like that?
It probably depends on which topic
Okay. Yep.
and the size of the company as well. Like how much do they already have built out, with like maybe the mission, vision, value stuff is once a year, but maybe that's, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, which I'm not great at talking about, but maybe that quarterly review of processes is part of the everboarding, because maybe you get time set aside to like learn about maybe better ways to do things, or maybe something that was documented, maybe some other person hasn't been involved in it and you have to go talk to another team, and building those relationships.
Yeah.
Um,
I wonder too if it ends up being another kind of touch point that happens around performance review and relationship review. Like we do these relationship reviews with our customers that might take place on a quarterly basis or a semi-annual basis, depending on the type of customer, size of customer, complexity of the customer. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations will do it right at renewal time rather than doing it on the quarterly basis or on the semi-annual basis or whatever frequency. And then ultimately it just turns into a, how can we grow your business, or how do we make sure we keep you, rather than how do we help you improve. Maybe this is one of those things to incorporate into your business. If employee engagement is important to you, employee retention is important to you, and you start to look at it and say, what's the right frequency to do these activities, both at an individual perspective, a team perspective, and maybe even an entire organization perspective. What do you think?
I like tying it into performance reviews as well as having performance reviews or whatever nicer word you want to use for them more than yearly, because who's going to remember an entire year's worth of work? Nobody. No, managers aren't going to remember. You're not going to remember unless, of course, you're documenting as you're going along. um, but yeah, that would be a good thing to tie into like reviewing processes, reviewing like how do your goals, company goals fit into your goals. And I like that idea.
So, Jen, we've talked about documentation, which we said, look, people don't like doing it. They might get judged. They might not know where to put it. It might not work inside their process. If you're one of those people who struggle with it, find somebody inside the organization who's okay with it. Or as Jen had talked about, start small with just a couple of little things. Like, a simple one might be document what your process is when you leave the house to go get eggs at the grocery store. Like, just lay it down. It's something simple. It's nobody else is going to look at it, but just document those things and you'll start to see some routine. We talked about the documentation of processes. We talked about that impact on onboarding. How do we, well, and the importance of reflecting and going back and revisiting each of those processes as you go through it. Who are the people inside the organization, inside organizations who think like this? Inside organizations, what type of roles do they typically have inside the organization? Where do they organize? Who are the people who think about processes just naturally?
So I would say operations people, but the tricky thing is a lot of operations people don't have operations titles. So trying to give you some job titles is difficult. And there are people who have operations mindsets that again may not have the operations title. But in general, those are people who are always thinking about processes and efficiencies and improvements and how everything works together and fits together.
If they don't have the title, what are some of the things that they maybe are asking about or doing or getting involved in? Like, what are some of the things that kind of indicate that they happen to be more process oriented or systems driven, even without the title? What do you see there?
I would say they're probably asking questions like, what have we tried before? Has anyone tried to improve this? Who is like in charge? Who can I ask questions about this? They probably don't use the word process, but like a specific specific task. Questions like, what about this? Have you tried this? Have we tried doing it this way? And other similar things could be a first indicator that someone might have an operations mindset. Like, how can we make this repeatable? How can we make it consistent? Questions like that they could be asking.
I love that you focused on like the what and the how and the have we type questions and not the why do we do this or why is that in there, because there's sometimes people get defensive when those questions around what, even the why ones can get people really defensive, but even the how and what questions when they come up can get people defensive because they're wondering, what are you questioning whether or not I can do my job? Why are you going to change my job? Like all of that kind of stuff. What's something that we can think about? Like, so the operators that are out there, and I know we're going to get into this discussion around how do we elevate ops inside organizations, but operators out there, are they really trying to take work away from people?
I wouldn't say taking work away from people, but making it better or
Yeah.
more efficient or making people have less work overall because of, again, efficiencies. I know we're using the word too much, but and they just want to understand like how everything fits together in the business. So that's maybe why they're asking the why questions. But the advice I would give to that is add context to your why question or try to get to like the question behind the question, which is usually more like a what or a how question. As you mentioned, that sounds a little less defensive. Your answer you might not get the answer of like, this is because I was told to do it this way, or because we've always done it this way. That's kind of what why questions might lead to, even if, why is the question inside your brain. As you kind of talked about, phrasing it in a different way, adding more context can get you the information that you're looking for.
These roles, at least the ones that I've come across, are less focused on the people side of things. Like they're more focused on the how do I help? How do I enable? How do I improve? Not how do I direct people to do things? It's how do I learn? I think that's sometimes it gets misunderstood. Well, and I'm speaking personally. Sometimes I'm misunderstood because I ask a lot of questions, and the view is I'm asking the questions because I'm judging the way people are performing today. And really, what I'm doing is I'm trying to get better at understanding what people are doing and how they're doing and how they fit together so that things can improve and that things can get better and we as we get more efficient we can actually do more of the work we want to do and less of the work that's kind of getting in the way of stuff. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think you brought up some great words that people could use and as context when they're asking questions to figure things out, is like help me understand how this works. I'm using the word learning. And then you had one more. I already forgot it, but it was good. Some good words for people to use so the people they're asking questions to don't misinterpret why they're asking questions or the question.
So let's talk about elevating the ops role inside organizations. How do we do it?
I think a lot of it is going back to basic foundations of like project management, communication, as we already talked about, managing up, a lot of sort of leadership. I think I know you talk about business acumen. That's a little difficult for me to wrap my head around, but as in general, like learning about the business, how a business operates, those are all important things to know so people don't get stuck in the weeds of just like doing their tasks every day of like fixing things, which can be a lot of operations roles because they have like a lot of fires to put out. People send like this thing is broken, we have to fix it today. So seeing that bigger picture of like how their role can help more, I think strategically is a word that's used a lot, and how they can help the company in bigger ways than just fixing individual tools, for example.
Well, and you said you had said business acumen, and I think the thing that's there, you hit on how you simplify it. You simplify it by just asking, kind of like, well, what do we do? How do we do it? How do we make money? Who do we serve? Like these
Yeah.
basic questions. If you ask those questions in across all functions inside the business, you will gain a perspective of how people think, feel, and then ultimately what they start doing, act in think, feel, act relative to the business. So those simple questions that Jen just said as she was going through if we understand those questions, then we can get a better sense for how we make money, who we serve, why people stay with us, and then where everybody starts to fit into it. I wonder why we don't give enough credit to operations. Yeah, why do you think that's the case, or do you think that's the case?
I think it is the case. And I think a lot of it is because part of the job is trying to make things as smooth as possible. And you might not be like drawing attention to yourself to say, like, hey, here's the success of operations, which is something we talk about in the boot camp I help make for HubSpot about how operations can talk about the successes and communicating your success so people recognize it instead of just trying to stay like behind the curtain in the background, making everything run.
Yeah. If you've got operators inside your business who are really focused on helping make the work get done, like keeping the trains moving on time and
Mm-hmm.
making sure the right people are on the right trains and making sure the right luggage is on the right trains and making sure that all of that stuff kind of moves along. And you see them doing that work, recognize them, thank them, highlight how important they are to the business, because a lot of times it's that mortar that holds all of the bricks together that keep things moving together, which doesn't really sound good because bricks don't move. But let's think about the lubrication and the systems that help the gears move through and help things flow properly in the business, and see where there's capacity challenges. And they get so focused on helping that side that they don't want to promote themselves and raise their hand and say, hey, I did this. Find ways to recognize them, because they're out there and they're the ones who will help make your business work much better than it's working today, and will continue to evolve in the direction that it should.
I would say that recognition is also going to help prevent burnout from doing all this work behind the scenes, but not getting recognized. And then you sort of start feeling kind of maybe resentful that like I'm doing all this work, I'm helping the company run, and no one realizes that I'm doing this work, and that can be bad. So, as you said, recognize these people. So they stay at your company and continue to do that good work of keeping the trains running.
It, and layer in some of those things that we've talked about as far as different touch points, like different meetings where you maybe have some information that you can share around how some key performance indicators have changed because of a change in process, how we've seen some improvement inside that process. Recognize those things both on internal meetings, team meetings, and broader organization meetings, because people want to hear about it. And even though they may not want to be brought up on stage to be recognized,
Mm-hmm.
it's good to hear it out loud. Like, I'm one of those people. I don't like to be brought up on stage and have everybody looking at me, which is kind of weird because I want to do more speaking, which ultimately gets you doing that kind of stuff, which is something I'm really struggling with, like mentally. It's this cognitive dissonance between not wanting to be that, but also wanting to be a part of it. And there are folks that are out there inside your organization who are interested in being recognized. Recognize them in the way that they want to be
Mm-hmm.
recognized, and ask those questions. What Let's talk about your boot camps. So what's going on with the boot camps? Who is the boot camp for? What are you doing with them? How do people find out more about them?
The bootcamp I just mentioned is HubSpot. It's through HubSpot Academy. It's called a RevOps bootcamp. It's kind of the foundations of how to be successful in a RevOps role. We talk about, again, the basics of RevOps to try to get everyone on the same page, which is a whole nother topic that I'm writing a book about because everyone is not on the same page. But we're going to skip past that right now and continue with the bootcamp curriculum. We talk about process mapping, so documentation and communication and communicating your success and creating a roadmap and communicating that roadmap, and then kind of careers and skills lessons. And that information seems like, is it really RevOps? Does everyone need this? Yes, everyone does need to do those things, but it is often overlooked in RevOps because of all the requests that they get from so many different departments that they're just putting out fires all the time. And so we really wanted to focus on that in the boot camp, similar to kind of the other topics I talk about on my own classes with documentation and employee onboarding, things that really aren't taught in other places, or maybe you kind of pick up along the way in the job in some random order throughout your career, but it's not like set out in a curriculum type of order unless you find some sort of class, which I'm glad there are more and more classes on operations topics like these popping up. It's great to see.
So let's talk about yours. What are you working on right now that you're excited about?
So I have a documentation class that started out as a live 4-session class. And then I made it a recorded class after going through it live and improving it and improving the process, improving the course. And now it is offered on marketingops.com, and probably a live version soon will also be offered there. And then I'm excited about creating an employee onboarding course in a similar format, because of the live format's really popular because it gives people accountability to actually doing and learning and showing up, and not just learning from me, but learning from peers, because there's always time built into these classes for like doing some of the work in kind of like the guided exercise templates I give them, and time for discussing it with each other and discussing it with me. So it's not just like something they could see in a video, which they could just watch a video for. And yeah, so an employee onboarding one will be next, but right now I'm just gathering research about like what would be helpful for people in a class to learn about, at least in like a class number one of the series.
So if folks want to help you with that, or provide feedback around what would be helpful, or engage with you directly, where's the best place to send them?
Probably either LinkedIn, or I have a website that's myname.com, which I'll be like in the title of this show probably, so I don't have to spell it. But either place, you can connect with me there. Again, my email is again my name, jen@jenberger.com. Again, the spelling's in the title somewhere. You can find it in the podcast. Email or LinkedIn are probably great places to connect with me and share information about employee onboarding that would be helpful, or any other questions that people might have.
So follow Jen. She is very active on LinkedIn. If you're part of Pavilion, she's active in Pavilion Slack channels. Follow her, connect up with her. I will include links in the show notes so that it will make that a little bit easier for folks to do that. If you found this conversation valuable, share it with Jen and I via LinkedIn. When we see those shares, it creates a space where we can engage in the conversation. And it's just good to see that go out there, and it gets more people access to resources like this, or makes people more aware that this content exists out there. Sales is a thinking process. Business is a thinking process. Life is a thinking process. How are you thinking differently about your process?